So hey folks, Zito here. This week I'm building a wooden collar out of recycled skateboards, of course, for my Chemex. Inspired by folks like Justin LaRose, or Epically A Justin on Instagram, who's made a bunch of these, and also Peter McKinnon put out an epic intro to one of his vlogs this week with a Chemex that he made. I knew I had to make my own. It's something that's kind of been in my head for the last year or two, and I'm happy I finally attempted it and kind of successfully pulled one off. So this week, here's that particular project, and any comments or questions, anything afterwards, please feel free to comment below. I hope you enjoy. Take care. So as always, I start with a bunch of broken skateboards. Looking at the collar itself, it's essentially a cylinder that tapers in the middle. The inner diameter at the middle point is actually about 2 inches. I later actually found that to be too small. It was a bit bigger than that, but that's what I thought initially anyhow. The outer diameter seemed to be about 3 1/4 or so inches at the biggest part. And again, I should have gone bigger than that, but that's sort of what I saw and measured initially. And so I decided to start with a 3.5 by 3.5 block. I was fortunate enough to pull all the material from this collar actually from the noses and tails, which is kind of interesting. I normally use them from the middle sections, but actually the noses and tails are great because they're actually pretty flat sections of skateboard, so it just makes for, not as much sanding and shaping as you would normally have to. Once cut down to size, approximately 3.5 by 3.5 inches by 3 inches tall, I glued the boards together, which would basically be my starting material to create this collar. Allowing for it to glue up for about 24 hours, I then took the piece of block out of the vise and marked its center lines and drew a circle to show the approximate shape of the starting cylinder that I would need. Once that was drawn, I cut the edges with a bandsaw, and then I took it to the sander just to refine the edges a bit. I find that when you take it with just a simple block, especially with skateboards and laminates like this, putting those tools right in those crevices and things like that can tend to blow up. So I try and take as many precautions as I can, and I basically sand it down to as close as a cylinder as I can, just to help the whole turning process as a whole there. So from there, I use the 4-jaw chuck. I essentially put the block, the close to circular block, into a 4-jaw chuck, and then I run the lathe at its lowest speed. The first thing is I use a roughing gouge, and with the roughing gouge I actually with the sections that are available for me to basically cut on, I cut it to a better cylinder essentially, and once it's actually fully a cylinder, from there I actually use the parting tool to take down my middle to the approximate diameter that I needed it to go to. For that I actually use calipers. Calipers, I was able to basically measure that the outside diameter was approximately 3 inches on the collar itself. So then I would take the caliper, and basically as I was going down with the parting tool and cutting in with the parting tool, I would then take the caliper and then place it on top of the area until I found that it fit at about 3 inches or so. So once I got that center line pared down to exactly where I wanted to go, I then turned back to the roughing gauge and went to the outside top edge, which would have been the thicker part of the collar, and worked that and tapered the shape down to the center line that was marked up at approximately 3 inches there. From there, once I essentially have the shape down for one side of the cylinder itself, I then take it out of the 4-jaw chuck and basically give it a 180 so I can work on the other side that was essentially clamped down. From there, I basically have the rough shape of the wooden collar itself. Of course, it's got a ton of material left in the inside and everything like that. So the next part there is actually to take it off the lathe altogether and then bring it to the drill press. Since the inner diameter I measured initially was about 2 inches, I then took a 2-inch drill bit and drilled right through the center of that thing. So with a straight 2-inch hole drilled, we then needed to taper the insides to the approximate shape of the Chemex itself, of course. And so we've then put it back on the lathe. So to cut the inside of the wooden collar, I used a round-sided scraper chisel. Especially for skateboards, I found that this particular chisel is it works really well against plywood, and it takes off material quite readily as well. I've had the most success with this particular chisel, so that's why I decided to use it. I then would attack the edges of the wooden collar itself just to taper it in, and to measure, it was a pretty awkward kind of thing to actually measure. So what I would actually end up doing is using a Vern caliper, going back and forth with getting a rough idea of what the measurement was like on the actual wooden collar itself that was provided with the Chemex originally, I would then take it to the lathe and measure it up against the wooden collar that I was making. Once that shape was actually pretty close to what I thought would have been the actual Chemex shape itself, I then took the whole thing off and decided to cut that thing in half because we needed it to be in two sides to actually fit around the Chemex itself. So from there, with the shape roughed out all together and our two parts, the very first attempt at putting it onto the Chemex was nowhere close. And this is essentially just me kind of eyeballing it. So what I had to do then was to take it to a sander and pretty much sand down the shape up until I got the approximate fit. And so it was really a repetitive process of going back and forth between a sander and then also the wooden, and then also the Chemex itself, just to make sure I got close enough shape. And essentially, after I've shaped it close enough, I took it to an orbital sander, sanded down the sides to about 120, somewhere where I was pretty happy. And also, I generally take things to 120 so that I can put epoxy on them afterwards, knowing that, you know, hot liquids, it'll probably come into contact with hot liquids relatively frequently. So yeah, I decided to sand it down to 120 and epoxy it afterwards. And yeah, pretty much had a finished product from there. So a couple lessons learned. First thing was that I would have probably started off with a bigger block. My measurements originally were pretty tight. I thought the inside diameter was roughly 2 inches. It was probably a bit bigger than that because I found after I had bored out a 2-inch hole and then tapered everything down on the inside, I found that it really wasn't quite the fit and it still needed to be quite a bit bigger. So starting off with the material, a block of about 4 inch by 4 inch by 3 inches tall would probably been a better bet. Another one is that I'm pretty sure these things are made with mechanical lathes by Chemex. I'm not a master bolt turner by any stretch or anything like that, right? But if folks have any other suggestions as to how they would have done it or anything like that, please feel free to let me know or reference any videos below. Yeah, and then lastly, next week, over to more canoe building and more epicness to come, hopefully. So thanks a lot for tuning in, and yeah, take it easy. Peace.